Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines and speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On today's show, we speak with Jason Greenblatt, former White House Envoy to the Middle East. We ask him who is to blame for the ongoing discontent between his country and long-term allies in the Middle East. If former President Donald Trump could have stopped Russia from invading Ukraine, and we reflect on the past, present and future of the Abraham Accords. Mr. Greenblatt, thank you for joining us on Frankly Speaking. Now, you have been an envoy to the Middle East under President Trump. However, ever since the Biden administration took over, U.S. ties with long-term allies in the region, such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, have experienced quite a bumpy ride. So tell me, frankly speaking, why has the relationship deteriorated to this level and who is to blame?
Well, thanks for having me. I think it's deteriorated because of the Biden administration. We have to separate the UAE and Saudi. They're two different issues. I think with respect to the UAE, the Biden administration just was not sufficiently supportive of the UAE and its security, not sufficiently supportive, for example, when the Houthi terrorists attacked the UAE, downgrading the Houthis as non-terrorists, which is a ridiculous thing to do. With respect to Saudi Arabia, it's more complicated. President Biden, during the campaign, treated the crown prince in Saudi Arabia very disrespectfully, said he planned to make Saudi Arabia the pariah that it was, that there's very little redeeming social value in Saudi Arabia. Really just, I don't know what he was thinking when it comes to an important ally like Saudi Arabia and of course the UAE. And we thought maybe, or at least I thought maybe he turned the corner when he made that trip and met the crown prince and the famous fist bump and all that. But it's only deteriorated since then. And I think the primary reason is he's put himself into a corner where he's listening to left-leaning radicals who don't understand the region at all. They certainly don't understand the importance, value, and strategic relationship that the US has with the UAE and Saudi and others. And I think they're trying to push him to do things that make no sense for the United States.
And of course, there's been a lot of discussion about oil prices recently. We've seen OPEC recently announce they're going to be cutting production. Now, this is something that Washington has been very critical of. I read your column with CNN recently where you talked about some of these production cuts. And you talked about the fact that Abu Dhabi and Riyadh are not vassal states for the US. Now, of course, the production cuts are seen as being against American interests. So you've now received a lot of flack for this CNN column. Many people calling you unpatriotic. How do you feel about that? How do you respond to that kind of criticism?
I think it comes from also a place of non-education. First of all, I'm as patriotic as any American. I feel blessed to live in this country, but I'm also a realist. I spent 3 years at the White House. I spent 3 years in the Middle East, understanding the importance of the United Arab Emirates to the US, to the stability of the Middle East, the same for Saudi Arabia. And if you look at the political comments are completely one-sided. They say, do this for us. We don't care about your own needs. We don't care about your own budgets. We don't care about the fact that these are your assets, meaning the oil. You need to side with us, lower prices, so we, the United States, can do what we need. And then they blame Saudi Arabia and the UAE for standing with, and the rest of OPEC+, but in particular, Saudi Arabia for standing with Russia. If you look at the truth, you have, for example, the president of Ukraine thanking Saudi Arabia for a massive donation to Ukraine. You have other evidence that shows that this was not about Ukraine and Russia. This was purely about economics for the region, for OPEC+, for Saudi Arabia. And then you have these people in Congress who don't know what they're talking about. When they say they're going to remove US personnel and military equipment, what they don't tell the American public is that the United States needs those military personnel and the equipment in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Qatar, and in all these other places. Imagine what would happen to the region. Imagine what would happen to oil prices. Imagine how it will come blow back in the face of the United States of America if we did what they were saying. So they're
Well,
trying
because
to
that
go
was going to be my
toward.
next question, because there have been Democrats who've been calling for new measures to be taken against the kingdom. There's been some who've been arguing for a total ban of the sale of arms, as you've just mentioned. It sounds like you wouldn't support these measures. Do you think it would achieve US interests in any way?
No, not at all. What this achieves is pure political points. There's a midterm election coming up. By the way, and I don't know this to be true, but Saudi Arabia's statement implied that the White House asked Saudi Arabia to delay the OPEC Plus decision by about a month, which of course coincides with after the midterm elections. One of the reasons I'm particularly concerned about that is when the White House was asked about it, I think it was a Bloomberg reporter was asking the head of the National Economic Council, did you or did you not ask Saudi Arabia to delay the answer? All you got was deflection. He wouldn't say, no, he didn't. He wouldn't say, yes, he did. And when I see answers like that, it really drives home the point to me of, hey, what really happened here? And if they did ask Saudi Arabia to delay it, which of course probably they did because of the midterms, that's an investigation I hope Congress seizes on. But you don't see that coming out of the mouths of the congressmen who are trying to downgrade the relationship with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. All you see is political nonsense, which is going to be very detrimental to the United States if it gets any traction whatsoever.
So should that be accurate? Because we have heard some rumours, as you just suggested, that Mr. Biden's main priority for the administration was to potentially delay potential cuts until after these midterms. So if that did turn out to be accurate, what does that mean? Is it foreseeable that a current serving administration in the US would be prioritising these short midterm election wins over reducing the cost of energy for the everyday American?
Well, this is what they accused President Trump of when he was in office. They said he did certain things for political gain. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen in different administrations. I have no idea. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you accuse President Trump of doing that, then look at your own party as well. And if President Biden or somebody in the White House did that, let's figure out what they did and let the American public know. So to sort of tie all your questions together, and the answer is, when I see whether it's the heat I'm taking for the CNN piece or the comments from the congressman, they're very superficial. They don't understand reality. They don't understand economics. And they're purely based on politics at a very, very thin surface level understanding, which doesn't serve anybody any good.
Well, as you said, the White House has not yet issued a flat denial of the incident, and some Republicans are now calling for the matter to be investigated. Yet, at least from what we're seeing, there isn't much hype in the US media about this. So let me ask you, what reaction should we expect from the Biden administration and the Democrats in general?
Well, sadly, and I say this from experience, I think we'll see very little about it in the mainstream media. I think the Democrats will move on to a different issue. I don't think they're interested in learning the truth. I think they're interested in holding on to power at all costs. And I think they're going to ignore a very, very difficult issue. Our country it's always been somewhat divided, but our country has become extraordinarily divided over the last number of years. It's all about politics. And then there are casualties along the way. One of the casualties along the way is the US-Saudi relationship. To some degree, the US-UAE relationship, though that has not suffered nearly as much. And that's a shame because we need our friends and allies. I was watching a clip on a news program on CNN the other day, and you had a so-called Middle East expert say that the US and Saudi are not allies, in fact, that we don't have the same strategic interests. That's utter nonsense. We may have differences of opinion, we may have disagreements, we may have concerns, but that doesn't mean we're not friends and allies. Friends and allies can disagree.
Well, I wanted to just quickly go back to the investigation we were potentially talking about that some people have called for. Do you see any potential legal implications for the Biden administration? As a former lawyer yourself, what could we potentially see?
So I think we're going to have to wait till after the midterms. If the Republicans do end up controlling Congress, I think we're going to have a thorough investigation, no doubt, and they're going to probably try to throw the book at the Biden administration. I'm not a legal expert in this field, so I don't know what might happen, but having lived through or read about all the things they tried to attack President Trump with, none of which actually stuck. I think there could be legal ramifications, but I don't know what they may be. What I do know is that the American public deserves to know exactly what happened.
Well, you bring up the protests in Iran there. Another issue which doesn't seem to be getting much attention is the barbaric Iranian regime response to these ongoing protests. Now, the Trump administration was known for its maximum pressure policy on the regime. This is something President Biden has not continued. So, quite frankly, why does it seem like Tehran can always get away with murder under the Democrats?
Quite frankly, right? Absolutely. I mean, we're choosing, for example, this new or rehash of the old Iran deal above the freedom of the Iranian people. The mainstream media has not been interested really in covering the protests. They just started picking up the protests a little bit more this past weekend when you had the fire at the infamous prison. I have a podcast on Newsweek where I've been trying to cover it a lot because I think it's a terrible shame that the Iranian people are not getting the support they need out of the Biden administration, out of the mainstream media. There are certain outlets that are covering it, but most of the outlets covering it are already sort of preaching to the public, preaching to the choir of those who already support the Iranian people. I'd love to see the mainstream media covering it more and more and more. And I do think the Iranian regime is sitting there laughing at the Biden administration and saying, you know, you want this deal so desperately that you're going to cover up everything that we're doing in order to get this deal. And think about it. We are looking to Iran and Venezuela, of all places, to get oil instead of our own backyard and instead of doing business properly with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and others, OPEC Plus generally, to try to solve the oil problem. But we have no problem going to murderous regimes like Iran and Venezuela for oil, is what the message is from the White House.
Well, we had a leading figure from the Iranian opposition. She's based in London, and she was saying that at the very least, the Biden administration must shut Iran's embassy, must freeze its assets. What do you think? Would you support these kind of measures? And if you were able to give advice to the current administration, should they take it, what would it be?
Those are two very important pieces of advice. Shut the Iran negotiations down. By the way, they weren't really negotiations, right? We were relying on some of our European allies to negotiate. It was embarrassing. We looked weak. We're relying on Europeans who don't have the same interest as the United States of America. They're interested in doing business with Iran, making money from Iran. Now it's even worse because they're absolutely desperate for oil and other energies, so they have even more reason to do business with Iran. And look what's happened, right? You have Iran you have Iran supplying drones to Russia, Russia using those drones to attack Ukraine. So while Europe is busy trying to beg Iran for a deal, ostensibly on behalf of the United States, they're bringing the problem right back to their own backyard. It's outrageous. Definitely send a signal to Iran that the United States is no longer interested in talking. Definitely get our people, our allies, as best as we can on side and tell them that we need them to help support our sanctions. Let's see what happens if we were to ask the Europeans to be on side with us and the Europeans don't cooperate. Will these congressmen accuse the Europeans of choosing Iran and maybe Russia over the United States? I don't think so.
Okay, well, let's talk about the war in Ukraine, because I'd be interested to get your thoughts on how you think President Trump would have handled that situation. Do you think he would have been able to avert the war in Ukraine, or for the level it's been taken to? How do you think that would have unfolded under his administration?
I don't think President Putin would have done what he did if President Trump was in the Oval Office. President Trump was a tough president, and he was a very unpredictable president. And I think President Putin would not have seen an opening to do what he did. I also think that the world pretty much looked the other way. You had President Putin surrounding Ukraine. And yes, it's true, the Biden administration shared intelligence with our European allies and others saying they believed something might happen in terms of an attack, but nobody understood, nobody believed that President Putin would do it. I can't understand why anybody thought that President Putin would go through such a rigorous exercise of surrounding the country if he didn't plan on attacking it and invading it. And I don't think any of that would have happened under President Trump.
Okay, well, let's turn our attention to Israel now, because you, of course, recently published a book with a not so subtle title, In the Path of Abraham, How Trump Made Peace in the Middle East and How to Stop Biden from Undoing It. I can see it on the shelf behind you. Now, I want to challenge you a little bit here, because yes, the Trump era has seen historic peace agreements signed with countries like the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. But there was no progress with the Palestinians. So would you agree with critics who argue that your administration addressed the easy bits and left out the main issue unresolved?
So they're two very different issues. First of all, we did focus on the Palestinians, but like every administration before us, Palestinians cut us off. They didn't like President Trump following US law, recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, moving the embassy, which is US law. All President Trump did was follow US law. They cut us off. We are not the first administration they cut off. Indeed, if you look at President Abbas of the Palestinian Authority's comments just the other day, he said that he trusts Russia more than the United States. He said that President Putin respects international law and he doesn't trust the Biden administration. So the Biden administration reversed President Trump's policies when it came to the Palestinians, gave them back a bunch of US taxpayer money, helped them, is trying to help them. And the Palestinians, by the way, deserve help. Okay, I'm not against that. And yet the Palestinian leadership is kicking President Biden to the curb, the same way they kicked President Trump and our administration to the curb, the same way they kicked President Obama to the curb. We have to recognize that these are two different conflicts. There's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Israeli-Arab conflict. What the Abraham Accords did, rightly so, is it separated them and it took away the veto card from the Palestinians. If the Palestinian leadership wants better lives for Palestinians, they're welcome. I'm sure President Trump, if he was still in the Oval Office or goes there again, would welcome them with open arms. And I think President Biden welcomed them with open arms, but they refused to be helped.
Well, certainly you were seen as one of the chief architects in forming the Abraham Accords, but I wanted to draw your attention to an interview that happened back in 2020 with Al Arabiya News Channel. Now, former Saudi ambassador to Washington, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, said Palestinians have a just cause but failed lawyers. Now, of course, you knew personally people like Palestine's chief negotiator, Saeb Erekat, personally. So would you agree with Prince Bandar? And I'd be interested to hear how much blame would you put on the Palestinian people versus your own administration, your own team, for the lack of progress you've talked about?
Well, as a recovering lawyer, I think Prince Bandar's comments were right 100% on target. In fact, I often said, both in private practice and in the White House, a bad lawyer can ruin a really good deal. And I feel bad for the Palestinian people. They were promised things over decades, both by their leadership, by the people who represented them, by other countries, that were simply not implementable. So now you have decades of promises that cannot be kept. And I think if they had taken a step back, they would have realized that President Trump meant business. He really was there to try to solve the conflict for the Palestinians. We're probably the first administration to release a peace plan that was more than just a half a page or a page of noble and ideal sounding and lofty goals and aspirations that sound beautiful to the heart and to the ear and to the mind. But we put out a 60-plus page plan that gave details on how the Palestinians could have better lives. Was it perfect for the Palestinians? Far from it. Was it perfect for the Israelis? Far from it. No deal could ever be put down that everybody would say, wow, this is amazing. How did you figure it out? But the Palestinians refused to engage. I hope that over time, there are two things that have to happen with the Palestinians. One, they have to get their leadership house in order. You have two different leaderships among the Palestinians that people forget about. You have bloodthirsty terrorists in Gaza who subjugate 2 million Palestinians. They take away their freedom, their rights. There's terrible things going on in Gaza because of Hamas. And then you have a pretty much ineffective Palestinian Authority that people are sick and tired of. One day, I hope they'll bridge that gap and come up with new leadership that's realistic, that's willing to sit down with Israel, maybe with the Arab countries who signed the Abraham Accords, maybe even others, and try to figure out how to resolve the problem. But it certainly shouldn't come at the expense of Israel and the UAE's ties, Morocco's ties, Bahrain's ties, and maybe eventually other countries in the region. These countries do much better together economically and security-wise if they work together. And the world has only become a far more dangerous place since we left office, so they need each other more and more.
Well, former Saudi intelligence chief Prince Turki Al Faisal, now he appeared on this show and he said there is yet to be evidence that embracing Israel would make things better or easier for Palestinians. And in a way, he does have a point. Tensions and conflicts between Israelis and Palestinians didn't lessen, even with your administration offering Israel the crown jewel, which was, of course, the US recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Do you think that you might have given Israel too much and asked for too little?
No, because that basically ignores US law. When Congress, on a bipartisan basis, passed the Jerusalem Recognition Act, it said three things. We recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, move the US embassy, and the third thing was, unless the President of the United States thinks that there is a national security reason not to follow US law, this is what needs to be done. It doesn't say, but don't do this if you think you could squeeze something out of Israel, if you could get into a better negotiating position, if the Palestinians will be upset. None of that is part of US law. So US Congress, on a bipartisan basis, I can't remember the number, but it was nearly unanimous, passed that law. President Trump respected it. He made a promise during the campaign, like all presidential candidates since that law was passed. He's the only one to recognize it. But those who argue that we gave Israel too much don't understand that besides correcting the historic wrong and allowing Israel to name its capital like any other country, President Trump was following US law.
Well, certainly other countries don't necessarily agree. Australia has recently reversed its decision to recognise West Jerusalem as the capital there. Now, in many respects, it feels like they're really calling for the status of the city to be resolved through peaceful talks between Israel and Palestine. So I guess overwhelming the feeling, it seems to be that the world would rather have a negotiated solution rather than an imposed one that you're arguing for. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, we're not imposing our view on Australia. We're not imposing our view on any country. Australia doesn't have the law that the US has. Australia, although I think it was a tactical mistake of Australia to withdraw the recognition, Australia is free to do what it wants. We might have encouraged others to do what we did, but we haven't changed anything. And for those of your listeners who haven't been to Jerusalem, let me tell you something. If you go to Jerusalem, you realize how amazing the city is, full of Muslims and Jews and Christians, Arabs, Israelis, everybody walking around. A couple of months ago, I was in Jerusalem shopping at the Mamilla Mall. It's filled with Jews and Arabs, Muslims. I was sitting in a fine restaurant with my wife. A Muslim-Arab couple walked in next to us. We had tables next to each other, enjoying the dinner. And then we went shopping. And what happened in the middle of shopping? All of a sudden, there was a threatened terror attack. My wife and I ended up in the storeroom of the store. And who was with us? Arabs, Muslims. We were all cowering in the back, worried about what was going to happen. It's not perfect. It's true. There are conflicts that rise up. But the conflicts are made by the troublemakers, by the people who want to make political points. For the most part, until, and I should say if, this conflict is ever resolved, the city manages through these conflicts as best as it can. And people should go visit it because they'd realize how much they see in the news media is not actually how the city works. Again, yes, there's a lot of things that could be done to improve what's going on. And I don't want to pretend for a second that there aren't things like that that should be done. But the city does work, and it works very, very well.
Well, you say one of the things that needs to be improved is Palestinian leadership. But with all due respect, there's certainly been major challenges for Israeli leadership as well. I guess the counter argument is that if the Palestinians were to come to the table now, it would be very difficult to have a unified Israeli front.
That's true. And here I agree with President Biden. And he said this before the elections in Israel were called. But he said now is not the time to try to negotiate peace between the Israelis and Palestinians. And there's lots of reasons for that, including many that I address in my book, but also the one that you're pointing out, which is important. We have to wait till the Israeli election happens in November. We have to see what kind of election it is, who gets in power, whether they have a strong coalition. The last coalition tried its best, not the one with Yair Lapid, but Naftali Bennett, tried its best to get the government going again, but they certainly were staying away from any peace negotiations. But this is the time for the Palestinians to try to get their house in order so that when Israel finally has a strong government in place, the Palestinians can be ready to negotiate. If they wait until it happens, they may find themselves having missed the opportunity yet again.
Well, what are your expectations? As you mentioned, Israel goes to the polls in a couple of weeks. Do you think Netanyahu, who's recently released his memoir as well, do you think he'll be able to make a comeback? What are your expectations?
I don't bet against him. He's a super talented politician, a brilliant politician. He's certainly doing everything he can to get back into power. I try not to guess about Israeli politics. In many ways, they're even messier than US politics, and anything could happen. So it's very, very hard to say. But I do think Israel needs finally a stable, long-serving government, if that's at all possible.
Well, speaking of US politics, my final question, I can't let you go without asking your expectations for the midterm elections in November, not too far away now. What are you expecting? What kind of outcome are you looking at?
A little while ago, I was confident in the Republicans taking control again, and then I lost confidence, and now you have the oil pricing and other pressures being put on the Democrats. It's a toss-up, honestly. I'm not confident. I'm not confident the Democrats will win. I think this is a real nail-biter. The most important thing to me when people ask me this question is to tell my American friends, get out and vote. This is one of the most consequential elections in my lifetime. Don't take it lightly. Get out and vote for the party that you think is going to do the best job for the United States of America.
Well, that's all we have time for today. Jason Greenblatt, thank you so much for joining us today on Frankly Speaking. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me.